You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
I won't see anything.
The statistics say that every year London has 40 nights of fog. And who will they murder tonight, I wonder?
Every morning, the police discover a new victim.
Who's the dead man?
The crime wave continues, and Scotland Yard combs the harbor in search of the madman. Where is he? Who is he?
A gang calls itself that because they pull their crimes in the middle of the night.
Watch it, it's hot. Very hot.
Fear reigns. Danger lurks everywhere. And the police are powerless. Terror grips another victim. And another. And still another.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Ms. Sam Deegan.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Dr. Nicholas Schlegel.
Hello.
On this special episode, we are looking at a pair of Krimi films, Dead Eyes of London and Creature with the Blue Hand. What is a Krimi film, you ask? Or maybe you didn't ask that. I can't hear you. Well, either way, we'll be discussing that as we go ahead. Know that there's an element of mystery to both of these films we're discussing today, and we plan on ruining that mystery for you. You have been warned. We're going to start with Dead Eyes of London from 1961, directed by Alfred Vorher. The film concerns a string of killings of foreign men in the fog of London by a ring of blind men. Nick, when was the first time you saw The Dead Eyes of London, and what did you think?
I came to the Krimis rather late. I write about in the book, in the introduction, that my first sort of like ephemeral contact with them was in the Sinister Cinema catalogs of Film Facts, you know? They had the little Edgar Wallace section in there with maybe 6 or 7 films, and the pedigrees, of which Dead Eyes of London was one of them, and the pedigrees looked really impressive. I knew the actors. Obviously, Kinski was in several of them. But I wasn't quite motivated enough to get a hold of them through Sinister Cinema. And so it just kind of just percolated in the back of my mind for a long time that there's this unique outpost of German cinema that I really need to, get into eventually. And I think it was when I finished the last book that I really kind of went out to see what had been written about it in the English language. And at that time, there wasn't much. Sam had written some stuff and continues to write really amazing material on it. But in English, there was no book length study, and there was no. There was a few chapters here and there in like edited anthologies, but no deep dive into it. And yet in Germany, it was so unbelievably popular. So it was right around then, around 2014, 2015, that I started amassing the library of Krimis. And one of the very first ones I watched was Dead Eyes. So I saw it maybe 5th or 6th in the rotation, and it immediately became, and still remains, top 3 of most important Krimis, top 2 maybe, but it's just a personal favorite too. I loved everything about it. It does mark the introduction of Vorher to the series, as well as Kinski, as well as the blood color titles over the black and white stock. That was a first in that film too. So it kind of really heralds itself as quote unquote important, and it really amps up the horror elements that the previous three films, the three Rialto films, were somewhat attenuated in that, except for the very first film, which really revels in its violence. But the next two are a bit lighter, and then when we get to Dead Eyes, it's really in gothic horror territory, and in some ways it really stamped itself as unique on me, and it remains one of my favorites.
Sam, how would you define what a Krimi is?
It's basically a nickname that comes from Kriminalfilm, which just means crime film, which of course these are anything but straightforward crime films. The best way to describe them to genre film fans is to sort of say that they're like a mystery-focused precursor to the Giallo movies. That's definitely how I came across them. I randomly, when I was like probably 20 or 21, found this disc that was this like really poorly produced double feature of this Italian Gothic horror movie, The Ghost, with Barbara Steele. And for whatever reason, Dead Eyes of London was the second film, like the double feature, under the title Dark Eyes of London, which is the name of the novel. And so it was also my first Krimi film, and I had no idea what to expect. Part of why these are still not popular with genre film fans is because there's not really a good resource on how to find them. They're not readily available if you don't speak German. And unlike a lot of the Italian releases, the German discs, even if you're a collector and, you have an all-region player, most of those German releases do not have English subtitles. So if you don't have some background in German, it's like wandering in the dark trying to find them, at least as of the last couple of years. I think that's gotten easier, but they are such a perfect mashup of crime and gothic horror and comedy to a certain extent and police procedural that it is really hard to just define them in a sentence.
Now, the name Edgar Wallace has come up a few times just in the first few minutes of us recording. To be a Krimi, does it have to be based on a book by Edgar Wallace? And who is Edgar Wallace?
This is one of those questions where, like, when you ask what is film noir, people get their panties in a bunch and everybody has a different answer. I feel like, so Edgar Wallace is a British mystery writer, which also is hard to explain to people because they're like, why is this German series based on the work of a British writer from like the 20s? It just makes no sense. But I think the classic Krimi films are based on Edgar Wallace books. And then you have these like secondary titles that are usually based on books written by his son, Brian Edgar Wallace. So I think as long as it's written by A. Wallace.
Nick, who was Edgar Wallace?
Kim Newman, I think, very brilliantly put his finger right on it when he said he's sort of the David Hasselhoff of literature in Germany. I mean, he was a very prolific author. I mean, he wrote just under 200 novels, about close to 1,000 short stories, about 24 stage plays. And they were all kind of hatched from the same type of DNA. They all didn't really alter from each other very much, but he was capable of dictating them, in massive amounts, and they were extraordinarily popular. I mean, it was Dickensian, really. I mean, these things were in these novels were in the hands of from popes to chimney sweeps, as the old expression goes, and of course. As Tim Lucas has written a lot about, he's one of the first draftsmen of RKO's King Kong, so I mean, he kind of really had a big part in the early stages of that before he died. He's still extraordinarily popular among many generations in Germany. The one generation he's lost some pull with would be Gen Z. Millennials are hip to him because of their parents and grandparents, obviously Gen X and above. But yeah, he's not really as well known among the real youth culture of Germany. But I was, when I was in Germany doing research, I I was really astounded at the depths to which Wallace meant to so many people in Germany, in both East and West Germany. And so I really kind of wanted to tackle the book with a certain amount of reverence for that, but also, yeah, like Sam says, they are an incredible mashup of so many different sort of genres and subgenres. They have that James Bondian supervillain thing going on as well, which is, and the other thing that Sam pointed out was, that's Arthur Brauner's CCC kind of muscled in on the racket to try and, they had secured the rights to Brian Edgar Wallace's work. And so they were doing these sort of copycat films, and they were kind of, aping the same artwork on the posters. They were sort of stealing actors over when they were free. And so they were trying to sort of just conflate the popularity of the Rialto. And they didn't make nearly as many because they, for various reasons, one being just product shortage of novels. There's only so many they could use. I find a huge difference between the Rialto and CCC films. I enjoy the CCC films, but they're not really part of like that Rialto, what I call, but I'm certainly sure I'm not the first one to call it that, but I call it like the Krimiverse,
That's also why I feel like they're the secondary titles, because they don't have a lot of those major players. I mean, Arthur Brauner is a fascinating figure, and I feel like we have way too much to say to talk about him in depth, but he definitely had a way of poaching things for his own studio, but he still couldn't get all the, I think most important players away from Rialto, because they almost had this little network of this pool of directors and writers and cast and crew members. So you see, sort of like you do with Giallo films in Italy, but even more tightly knit. There's just this specific group of people who made the core Krimi films, which I think is so fascinating. And it also makes it worthwhile if you watch a couple of the films and you fall in love with them and you can track a bunch down. It's great to see the ways in which they use their stock actors. And in some of the later films, they start to switch people up, because you have these typical actors who play the sort of heroic detective and the older kind of stodgy inspector and the comic butler and the token bad guy. And then later on, they kind of start to interchange them. And it's even more fun when you can see what they're doing and how they're trying to mess with your head.
To try and keep things fresh, they would just have, once you thought you had a character actor pegged, I make many alliterations in the book to the comparable business model is very much Hammer. It's totally. It's sort of the exact same vibe. A village of talent, a very close knit run studio. Everybody, Christmas parties, the whole 9 yards. Everybody friendly, and if you didn't fit in, you didn't work on many films. It was pretty obvious. That
is a really perfect parallel. I didn't even think of that.
I was at the Brauner archive. He was still alive at the time, a couple of summers ago. But I kind of, the trail went cold for me. I'm like, I will talk about these films as I need to, but I'm going to make the focus of this book on the Rialto films. But yeah, Brauner did so much for the crime genre in the early 50s. It's one can almost argue that Rialto kind of poached Brauner's territory in the first place, because he was making these crime movies that were flash in the pan. They didn't really catch on quite as much, and yet they're really quite good, several of them. And then they kind of just dissipated, and then Rialto kind of took the baton and ran with it.
They found the formula.
Exactly, found the formula. Yep.
Nick, you've mentioned the book a few times, and for people that don't know, what is the book that you're talking about?
'Tis folly to try and write a book when on something called the tenure track. When you're trying to get promotion and tenure at a university, it's really a dumb, stupid idea to say, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to try and prove my worth and make these people, impressed. And it was just pure masochism. I should have done it a slightly different way, but I was eager to try and, as my old advisor used to say, cut down some trees and leave a little piece of me behind again and start bring up the pen and see what would happen. Ultimately it turned into a book that its current title is, because it's had several, is German Popular Cinema and the Krimi Phenomenon, Dark Eyes of London. There's a little colon right there. Really, it goes back to the end of World War II to look at the formation of German popular cinema, because there was the big film pause after the Second World War. As you guys are well aware, most cinema-producing cultures had relatively ceased production in Berlin. Studios were either demolished or seized. So there was a big film pause, and then there was a re-education on the part of the Allied occupation to sort of bring in Hollywood films that would reinforce kind of democratic ideologies. And to Germany's, shame might be a bit strong, but they really resisted that. And I'm not saying that sort of the cultural imperialism of Hollywood films was what they were supposed to do, but they didn't want to sort of like deal with the war and the aftermath of the war. And one of the ways in which they do that is they come up with the Trummer film. Are either of you familiar with the rubble films of post-World War II Berlin? I imagine you are, Sam. I'm not sure if Mike is.
I recently watched The Apple Fell, which seems like it was shot in rubble, but I'm not sure if that counts.
I don't know that one. The first one was called The Murderers Are Among Us. And it was made
they're amazing.
46. I figured, Sam, with what you've been writing lately, that would be something you would know very well. So I kind of traced the origins of all that, and then how eventually German popular cinema comes to dominate for the next 20 years, and then how basically that then all goes up in flames too, and by that time, I think the Oberhausen Manifesto had gained, in popularity among the sort of young Turks filmmakers of Germany, and that would come to dominate the new German cinema of the 70s, and it was all over. And it's a pity, because this whole era, the Schnitzel westerns and the Heimat film and the Kommissar X films and the Karl May Winnetou film, all of the German popular cinema of this era is beautiful, as I'm sure both of you would agree. It's shot by former UFA technicians and craftspeople, they are gorgeous to look at. And yet they were kind of just really relegated to the dustbins in Germany, kind of swept under the rug.
It's such a strange set of circumstances. I just wrote about the rubble films a lot because I have a book coming out soon about European art house films in World War II. And so I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the ways that different countries who played a part in the war, either as Axis powers or as countries who were occupied, how they dealt with the war in cinema in the sort of immediate decades after it. And it's so kind of frustrating to look at the way that, and I'm sorry I keep bringing this back to Italy and giallo films, but it's sort of frustrating to look at the way that other countries dealt with genre cinema as compared to Germany, especially in terms of like sci-fi and horror movies. You have this real lack of films being made. And I think some of it is that Germany just did not want to deal with the war. And a lot of those rubble films are this very hard to describe blend of depressed, traumatized, miserable people trying to return home to homes that have either been destroyed or somebody else has moved in or something terrible has happened. But the movie is like forced to have this optimistic ending. So they can't really say, all right, how are we going to deal with what we did and what we took part in? They're just like, okay, it's over. Now we're going to survive. The German horror movies, the few that exist from the 60s, around the time the Krimi were being made, are all really kind of like low budget and schlocky, and I think they're fun, but it's almost like they were afraid to deal with more serious themes. And so I think a lot of that gets, maybe on purpose, but maybe accidentally pushed into the Krimi films, where you have this continuation of the crime film serials that Fritz Lang was making in the 20s, where you have this like vast criminal conspiracy network headed by these sort of Medusa-like villains, but in this almost cartoonish way that I think makes them so fun and so special. But it's also just like such a strange combination of genres.
While I was doing my research for this, I really knew nothing coming in, and obviously talking with you guys, I know a fraction of what you know, but I was so fascinated by the idea of Edgar Wallace and that his career hasn't really stopped. He was as far as I remember, he's a Black Mask writer. We've talked about Black Mask on the show before when it came to Hammett and other writers, I think even Robert E. Howard. We've got that going on. He has stuff being adapted by Hollywood. He even directs a few films, produces a few films. I think the first adaptation was way back in 1915. And other than the 5-year period of time around 1990, and there was a 5-year period of time, not even 5 years, around 2014, where there wasn't a adaptation of a Wallace work. And that also includes King Kong, because he's credited with the character of King Kong. But for so many years, every year you would have one, if not two, if not three Wallace films being made. And it was just amazing to look at. He's got 231 credits on IMDb, and okay, maybe 1915 there wasn't one, but you'd probably get two in 1916. You know, those kind of things where it's just like massive amounts of adaptation. So as we're talking about Dead Eyes of London, it's actually been remade, or this is like the third time, or at least the second time that it's been adapted. And plus there are probably TV adaptations. There have been television shows based upon his work. It's wild to see what an influence this guy had.
I like to imagine that somewhere in the afterlife, he and Conan Doyle are sort of duking it out to see who's going to wind up with the most number of adaptations.
We'll throw Stoker in there too, right?
Yes, definitely. Do not leave out Stoker.
They can all have a, battle royale. That'd be great.
You guys recommended Dead Eyes of London and Creature with the Blue Hand. And after I saw Dead Eyes of London, which was just a few weeks ago, I was hooked. That was the most fun I have had watching a movie in the longest time. I was just delighted.
That makes me so happy. And it's one of those subgenres that I love so much and I have such a good time with, but for whatever reason, I'm kind of wary about recommending them to people because it's sort of hard to sell. It's the sort of thing that you either are going to love or you're going to be like, what is this nonsense that I'm watching? But because they're like adult comic books where it starts off as a serious police procedural and people are being murdered and maybe there's some kind of criminal conspiracy. And then you have this like detective who's like knitting.
Oh, I love that guy.
He's the best.
No, that is the most iconic. So Mike, Eddie Arendt is without question the most iconic character of the series. He's on the cover of the book, for God's sake. So I mean, and yet, like Sam mentioned earlier, I chose to put a still from him as the corrupt priest in Hunchback of Soho, which is another retreading of Dead Eyes of London.
Well, I didn't realize that there was, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but was it Karloff was in a version of this as well? Like an early version? Was it?
Oh, yeah.
Lugosi, that's what it was. Thank you.
Yeah, that had two different titles, right? The Human Monster, I think Monogram put it out, and then...
Yeah.
And then in England, it was Dark Eyes of London. That's quite a good film, too.
What I was reminded of while I was watching this was the Seijun Suzuki Yakuza films. Just that kind of, we're messing around with the form and doing things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Some of those things and I know I'm jumping right into the plot and we'll go back, we'll recap a little bit, but when they're talking about how the dead men who have been dropped in the Thames are floating back up to the surface and they realize that they must have been laden with salt or sugar and they pour all the sugar or salt into the one guy's cup of tea and then They bring the T forward right into the lens, and it's just this massive, extreme close-up. And then you get the music sting that goes with it. Those music stings are life itself. I loved every single time that happened. I love those goofy close-ups. I love the skull on the guy's desk that was the cigarette dispenser.
Oh, it's my favorite. I want one so badly.
Oh, so cool.
You cut from that to the black cat thing that is like the doorbell. Yeah, the doorbell for the speakeasy.
Those are what I call voyeurisms, man. You find those in all of his movies.
So I watched Dead Eyes, then I went to Creature with the Blue Hand, and then I wrote you guys in desperation, what should I watch next? And so, I love, Nick sends me this email, he's like, okay, well, here's a couple of my favorites, and it's a list of like 25 titles.
That's how it happens, though. That's seriously how it happens, where you get hooked. Like Nick was saying, there are definitely some classics, and I think we picked two pretty good examples from the early period and from the slightly later period, but there are so many that have all of these kinds of touches, and they're just, it's almost like if you turned Batman, the TV series, if you combined it with giallo movies and a police procedural and also the Addams Family.
There's this weird dissonance that goes on in the films because the first time I tried to watch Dead Eyes, I was watching it and it was English dubbed, and I was like, no. So I went out, I found the German language track, I found the English subtitles, I put all that stuff on, and then I was happy. But then you're watching a German film that is set in London.
Yep.
All of these characters are working with, Scotland Yard or calling Scotland Yard. You have insert shots of Big Ben and Parliament. And you get, I just watched the Green Archer last night.
Oh, I love Green Archer, yeah.
And here you have Auric Goldfinger coming off of this plane, and he's just like, blah, 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 oh, yeah, it's so great to be back in England. And he's saying this in German. I'm like, what?
Gert is such a sort of hammy villain in that. He's absolutely brilliant. Towards the end of that movie, he really knocks it up several notches into super villainy territory. It's wonderful.
Well, and you mentioned and I'm going to fuck up his name, but the guy who was knitting in Dead Eyes.
Eddie Arendt.
Thank you. I love him in The Green Archer at the beginning when he just turns right to the camera and says, well, this will make a good film, won't it? And then at the end, he's just like, oh, has anyone seen a green arrow around? And he turns around and he's got one in his back and it says, end.
They're very winking postmodern texts. They've got a lot of self-reflexivity. There's obviously intertextuality. I mean, they're really, pretty hip for their time and for now. I'm by the end of the episode, before we sign off, Mike, why don't I'll share with the listeners maybe 3 or 4 of my absolute favorites. I'm sure Sam can do the same, and that would be a good starting point, I think, because I definitely have my absolute favorites, because there are so many of them, and there are really 3 distinct eras, believe it or not, and I'm kind of basing that off of this guy. I always screw up the German pronunciation, but his last name's Kramp. He wrote a lot about the Krimis in Germany, and he kind of separated the Krimi into 3 distinct movements, and I happen to agree with him. And basically it's sort of like a beginning, middle, and end. There's no big spoiler there to how they're all laid out. What is sad though is that over the course of it, just like with Hammer, because when you think about Hammer, they start in 57, it's all over by 73, right, 74, and it's kind of the exact same thing with the Rialto Krimis. They start in 59, it's all done by 72, 73. It's really interesting parallel history there. What exactly? I think the decade of the 60s kind of just really put the final nails in the Krimi coffin, as it were. These films were a bit quaint compared to Jaws and The Exorcist and the Poseidon Adventure,
I would rather watch The Dead Eyes of London than Jaws.
I happen to agree with you, but I mean, just in pop culture, I think that.
I know.
That I definitely I'm with you on that. I'd rather watch Krimis all day long, but I think one of the reasons that they kind of just sort of fell off the landscape and the radar was they were just really rifling through their own graveyard in terms of
oversaturation to the max
and remaking every bloody thing. I mean, by the end, the adaptations were purely in name only. They had nothing to do with the source material, and they just kind of run their course.
They have very complicated plots, which I was surprised how much I had to pay attention to the films. It wasn't very easy at all. You mentioned the villains, and I was so reminded of Scooby-Doo watching these. The villains remind me a lot, especially with this first one where you don't really know what the person's after, and then you realize it's really a Scooby-Doo plot. The whole, I was trying to scare him off so I could get the gold kind of thing.
Those pesky kids. Wait, have you seen Fellowship of the Frog yet?
Not yet. No.
Oh my God.
No, I did.
Oh, The Mask.
The Mask is so great.
We've talked about how delightful and silly and sort of gleeful they are, but for probably most of your listeners who haven't seen any of these films, I think it's also important to mention that they can be incredibly kind of lurid and violent at the same time. The way that people, like the sheer volume of people who get killed, it's sort of like a slasher movie, but usually involving some sort of gruesome kind of gimmick. Poisoning people or stabbing people to death, that's like the tamest thing that happens in these movies. Like, they're not for little kids.
Let's talk about Dead Eyes a little bit more, because there are so many great parts to it and so many things that are happening in this movie. I just love it. I love the way it starts with the murder, and you've got the guy coming out of the shadows, Blind Jack, who looks like fucking Tor Johnson.
Adi Berber. He's the best. He's in so many of these.
These crazy hairy arms that he has. It looks like somebody grafted a gorilla to his shoulders. It's just as amazing. And at first I thought I didn't really see it necessarily. And then at one point when he goes and he's choking our female lead, I was like, oh my God, that's just all hair all over his hands and all over his arms. He's more monster than man.
Think of the kinder trauma that caused in generations of young German children,
So that's the thing that I love so much about these, is that it definitely has things in common with, like, as a subgenre, with Scooby-Doo and with the Batman TV show, the way that the villains are presented. But then there's all this genuinely nightmarish stuff. Like, people get tortured. It's just...
Oh, yeah.
Many traumatized children.
When you get to Die Bande des Schrecken, the terrible people, you'll see, there's a lot of the BDSM imagery that you see in The Face of the Frog comes back in that. And in fact, FSK, which was the basically the MPAA of Germany after the Second World War, they kind of put together something sort of comparable to that. They required some edits in that one because it was a bit too intense, and I do miss, and I bet Sam agrees, I always love the humor in the early films, the early to mid films, but I miss the seriousness though of the black and white era is kind of missing from the color era until we get to the Italian co-productions. They just kind of get sillier,
It does, and in a way, I almost prefer the mix of the early films better, because they do have those tongue-in-cheek, campy moments, but they also take their plots more seriously, whereas when, in the second part of this episode, when we talk about Creature with the Blue Hand, it's hard to watch it without just, like, collapsing into laughter, which is, and I love it, so I'm not saying that as a criticism. It is nice that a lot of these, the plots are a little bit easier to follow if you're somebody who watches a lot of mystery films or reads a lot of mystery novels. There are a lot of Agatha Christie-like plot twists happening where things are just really fucking elaborate. But if you read enough Agatha Christie, you kind of can see some of the things coming. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I do like that the earlier films are much more serious about unraveling those mysteries, and it's not all sort of flying in the face of probability like it does in the later movies.
Oh yeah, what a great way to put it, flying in the face of probability. Yeah, because in the earlier films there's a certain there's lots of levity, there's a certain seriousness, especially in Dead Eyes of London. That's a film that has its relief valve with Eddie Arendt always providing sort of the comedy. But the film really needs it because it goes to some dark places. I write, Mike, in the book about there's some, I never talk about how the Second World War is explicitly acknowledged in the Rialto series, but it does find its way. It's kind of impossible to erase the cultural fingerprints of what had happened in the previous 20 years. And there are just some scenes in there where I found them to be just a little too reminiscent of things that had happened during the war. And these were Fuchsberger, who was also one of the most iconic. He was every able man. I mean, he served in the Second World War. He was, I believe, captured in the Soviet Union. I better not be telling tales out of school. Yeah. I forget.
Yeah. A lot of them, including Klaus Kinski, of course, were POWs.
And what I found out, which was very fascinating, was that Horst Tappert was actually SS, and this was revealed posthumously after he died. It was something he'd kept, obviously, from the German public. And he went on, for listeners who aren't aware, this is a guy who sort of became quite popular by starring in several of these krimis later in the color era, but then went on to a television series called Derek, which was an absolute national treasure in Germany. It ran 25, 30 years, and so it was quite a surprise when it was revealed posthumously that he was actually Waffen SS.
Which is insane because, and I feel like this is very hard for more contemporary film audiences or even people who read history to understand, but it's like the sheer number of people who were in the German military and specifically who were in the SS. Where does everybody think they went? Most of them weren't killed. Most of them were not executed at Nuremberg. They just were reintegrated back into society. So the sheer level of, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, but the ability to delude themselves as a nation.
The Nazis, all they had were the 12-year-olds left by 1945. It was the Hitler Youth trying to defend Berlin. I mean, it was, as you say, every able body was conscripted into the military. So your point is so well taken. Where do you think these people went? They all fly to Argentina. Many of them stayed there, and I mean, that's something I have to address in the book. Is many of these people were writers and producers and worked in Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And what do you expect? This is post-World War. They need to have a life, and a lot of them wound up continuing on in the entertainment business in some way, shape, or form. And so that's just kind of what happened.
Which is why I think somebody like Arthur Brauner is such a good counterpoint to that, because he was a Holocaust survivor. Basically, his entire family was killed, and he managed to escape because he spent most of the war in Russia and came back and decided, I'm going to form my own film studio and make these really kind of edgy films that often showed the war in more transgressive ways than a lot of movies were doing for decades, basically until New German Cinema. And I think his main office, he opened in a former factory that made Zyklon B, basically. And so he considered his best revenge against the Nazis to thrive and make films about the war. And I mean, he lived until he died like 2 or 3 years ago, I think. He lived to be like 106. So cheers to you, sir. Even if you did make some spin-off Krimi films.
This Dead Eyes of London film it's just so rich. It's so rich with plot twists, and it's so rich with just amazing characters. I talked about Blind Jack already. We've talked a little bit about the inspector and his kind of valet / assistant that's in this. There's Flea Bite Freddy. There's Miss Ward, who can read Braille, coincidentally enough. There's
just randomly. That happens throughout so many of these movies where a character has some knowledge or some sort of skill that's integral to solving the mystery. And it's like, oh yeah, of course I can do blah, blah, blah. Like, can everyone?
I'm trying to remember the name of the barkeep who is he's amazing. He runs the speakeasy. He's got the black cat that lights up when somebody rings the bell. He's got an extra phone line, so if anybody goes to the main phone to make a pay call, he can listen in on whatever they're saying. It's fantastic. You've got Klaus Kinski as Edgar, who wears these mirrored glasses through so much of the film that Vorer just loves playing with those mirrored glasses and the reflections that we're seeing in those.
Yeah, we should talk about Karl Loeb for a second, who was cinematographer on a bunch of these, and probably my favorite thing about watching Dead Eyes of London, but some of these other films that he shot with other, like showing them to people for the first time, is people sort of get sucked into the plot and to all the stuff you're talking about, this like everything that's going on. And then they're like, wait, this is actually a really beautiful film. Like, look at all this cinematography. I'm like, yeah, I don't, it's Carl. Thank you, Carl.
I've got the entry for that film in front of me that I had sent you guys. And I'm gonna read this one little snippet here, which, has a lot to do with Karl Loeb, who I think more than any single person is directly responsible for the continuing aesthetic of these films. You know, the consistency and continuity from film to film. There's no question. I wrote, it's my contention, however, that if selected highlights of the first several Rialto Krimis were edited together into a montage and screened for scholars, historians, or simply fans of the genre, I'm confident that responses would run from provocative, eye-catching, and atmospheric to bold declarative statements such as works of serious art or the lost films of post-expressionist forgotten genius. Because, yes, the cinematography is and just the overall capabilities of the technical unit that Rialto had, that had this sort of like, you know, cottage industry quality to it from film to film. They are gorgeous. If we compare them, if we put them on the international stage, budget-wise, with product coming out of the United States, they would be B movies put out by Allied International, for example, or American International, or, you know, or some of the B units of the major studios. And yet, I find them to be far more competently, and I'm not picking on Allied or anything, but like overall, throughout these films, I see them, they are absolutely... They're gorgeous to look at. There's no question, which makes sometimes when I come across slightly pejorative or full-on pejorative discussions of the films, I don't know what planet they're living on.
It's so frustrating. Part of the problem is a lot of the time when people are discussing cult movie subgenres, for lack of a better phrase, I feel like they go into it with this attitude like, I don't have to take this seriously, and this isn't a real film. This is just, you know, some kind of schlocky bullshit that we can watch and have fun with, but also make fun of. And certainly throughout this episode, we've been laughing at things because there's so much to laugh at, but the film wants you to and does that on purpose. But there's also so much to take seriously and so much craftsmanship, and like, you could watch the scene that Mike just mentioned with Klaus Kinski wearing these shiny aviators, and the actual scene is reflected in his sunglasses. Like, it looks like it could come out of any sort of classic film noir. Like, it's just so gorgeous.
The scene in the elevator, that they set it up so well to have a character fall through the floor of the elevator with the fake paper floor, and then he's hanging there. He manages to catch himself, and he's hanging there. And then you get to your point about giallo films, you get these black gloved hands coming in and stepping on the fingers, burning the fingers with the cigarette. It's so gruesome. And then that he falls and you get the noise down below. You don't even have to see the dead body. You just get the noise and the people that come over and look in the door. Oh, it is wonderful.
You'll see some more fake floors under carpets in some of these movies.
They love fake floors, trap doors, anything that you can think of that will reveal something horrible that's about to happen. It's in these movies.
I don't want to sound like I'm some sort of, Sherlock Holmes myself, but I'm usually pretty good at figuring out these mysteries. I really didn't know where this was going because they set up so many red herrings throughout this. They really want you to think that Kinski is the bad guy in this for so much of it. And I'm just like, okay, it doesn't make sense that he's the bad guy because of X, Y, and Z. And when it turns out that I was right, that he wasn't, I was like, oh, okay, good. They're actually abiding by some sort of logic, because there are times where you're just like, there's no way that this could happen because, to your point, these bad guys, and it's usually, from what I'm seeing just with my limited knowledge of this stuff, it feels like there's the bad guy and then there's the person he's getting his orders from, especially in something like Creature with the Blue Hand. Even here with Blind Jack, there was a moment where I think they said he's just following orders. I was like, oh, that sounds very, very German of you to say.
Yes, and very sinister.
Blind Jack's death, oh my God, did that send shivers through my spine.
One of the general rules with these is the more impressive a villain seems, the more awesome their death has to be. And you also, probably my favorite trope in these movies, if I had to pick just one, is, like you were saying about Klaus Kinski's character here, there's usually the red herring villain, which is somebody that the film makes an effort to have them be so nasty, and you know that they're a terrible person, and when they're finally killed or arrested, usually killed, it's like, yeah, okay, they had that coming. But at the same time, you're like, but wait, if that super bad person wasn't the bad guy, who is?
It's the ne ultra plus of Scooby-Doo.
It definitely is. And we've already talked a lot about Edgar Wallace. I do think we have to give a little bit of a shout out to Egon Ice, who, in addition to having a super cool name, pun intended, he also worked on a lot of these scripts and I think took them very seriously. And so when you watch some of the more, and I'm a sucker for mystery stories, it's like my comfort food. And I think there are plenty of mystery films that are just so slapdash. It's like they threw a bunch of tropes together and people are getting chased around a house and being murdered. But like he actually took them seriously and was careful about what from Edgar Wallace he wanted to put in and what needed to be changed based on the novel length versus film running time. And it's so they do, I think, genuinely manage to surprise you, even if you are familiar with mystery tropes.
Agreed. And when you go from film to film, as I was doing over the course of 2 years, slowly sort of going from film to film, I found that to be very, very true, that there was a lot of careful attention paid to these scripts in the first, at least the first half, of the entire era,
Oh, yeah, then it goes downhill a bit.
It does start to slide, and
at least as far as what you're talking about, like serious mystery writing is concerned.
Actually, I can't wait till we get to the end, because one of my favorites, I suspect, might be one of Sam's favorites too, because it's maybe the most Agatha Christie-esque of them, perhaps, I think.
I like, too, that they make little references to Edgar Wallace in this movie, that having the name of Edgar as the Kinski character, and then I can't remember, I have in my notes here, Wallace crosses Edgar's name out of his ledger. So I'm like, oh, there's even a Wallace character, too. That's pretty nice. People getting shot in the fucking face, like multiple times in this movie.
Buddy, I'm gonna shoot you in the face!
Fucking flamethrower going on towards the end of this movie. It just keeps ramping up and up and up. This was just a thrill ride watching this. I really could not get over it. I was so happy. I love too, like the inspector's assistant character. Sonny is his character's name in here, with that fucking bowler hat. And isn't there even a time when he will take the bowler hat off and put it over the camera, which I love as well?
Yes, he makes me so happy. To a certain extent, he's like the Jerry Lewis of Krimi films, because they always give him these like very physical things to do. And I think it has a way of drawing your eye always to his character, sort of like I've always heard these anecdotes about how when Donald Pleasance was cast in a film, he would find something either like eating candy or fixing his tie. He would find a way to force your eye to naturally go away from the other actors and to him. I don't think Eddie Arendt necessarily was doing that on purpose, but his mannerisms throughout all of these, whether he's supposed to be like the comic, sidekick or not, are just great. Like, he's such a perfect character actor.
He's a total scene stealer, but without being the scene stealer. He's not trying to do it, I mean, I could be naive, but it just doesn't seem really in character with him. I think he was sort of naturally suited these types of roles. And of course, by the time they get around to doing a 180 on that, it becomes just as interesting all over again. I think he left the series ultimately just when he felt he had nothing left really to offer it, because the series was kind of, it was kind of limping by then. So
yeah, you almost have to feel bad for Fuchsberger, who played the lead inspector in so many of these, and he's such a good straight man. He kind of, in a certain sense, can't compete with people like Eddie Arendt or the villains like Klaus Kinski, or it's just like, okay, you're the sort of normal, boring guy.
Yeah, Mike, exactly. So Fuchsberger, he's usually the lead detective in a good chunk of these, and he's often opposite Siegfried Schoenberg's Sir John, who starts off playing the character a certain way, and then ultimately starts becoming very Schultz-esque, like,
I see nothing. I was not here. I did not even get up this morning.
And again, Fuchsberger's kind of robbed there, because not only does he have to deal with, Eddie Arendt being the comedy, the sidekick, but also with Siegfried now starting to try and steal scenes as well. So,
and he's great at stealing scenes.
So good. I can't stand his replacement, though. I really take him to task. I mean, I forget the actor's name. Nothing against the actor, but the inspector, Sir Arthur, or whatever. That he's so lecherous and so I can't stand him. He drives me nuts. When he's not in the film, listeners are probably going, what in the hell are you talking about? It's just that the character of Sir John, who's the head of Scotland Yard, is this recurring character in film after film after film, and an actor became synonymous with the role. When he left, they replaced him with another fine actor, but who had an entirely different interpretation and really rubbed me the wrong way, unfortunately.
Did you manage to see I think it was the last 5 films that Eddie Arendt made in his life where he was Sir John in a revival of Wallace stuff?
I know of them just from IMDb and research. What about you, Sam?
I haven't seen them either, and I really am. It's like I want to, but I'm afraid to at the same time.
Eddie Arendt he is fantastic. I love his knitting and his incredible marksmanship. You mentioned how Fuchsberger plays the inspector and a lot of this stuff. I was really hoping that he and Sonny were going to be the two people that carried us all the way through all of these films. So I was a little sad when that didn't happen, but I do like, to your point, that they show up in different aspects. So even if I can't get Eddie Arendt as Sonny in everything, at least I get him showing up in.
One of my favorites, Mike, The Inn on the River. There's a great sort of relationship between them in that one too. Arendt's hilarious in that.
Does he keep knitting throughout the whole thing?
No, he's doing like he's rowing. He's like Oxford rower in this.
Yeah, he's always given something phiscal to do.
Like I said, I didn't see who it was that was going to be the bad guy at the end. I really loved, and I don't want to ruin the end for people, even though I warned that we would.
Yeah, don't.
I will just say I loved when there was an accusation made about who was the murderer, and then they turn around and they look through a peephole and get shot in the face. And you're just like, well, I guess they're not the murderer.
So I dedicated the book. I was planning on interviewing her. She is the Krimi queen. And I dedicate the book to her. And I was going to interview her, but tragically she died in 2017. The Krimi queen is Karen Dor, who had acted in, oh gosh, I forget. I think there's either 5 or 6 of the Rialtos and a couple of the CCCs as well. She just lent, I think, such a sophistication and a class and an elegance to the and in some films she's actually the protagonist. Like you said, you just watched Green Archer, right, Mike? So she's like the female protagonist in this film. She's extraordinarily. I haven't watched it in a couple of years, but she's extraordinarily capable and physical. They have her like going back and forth between these 2 castles, going through like minefields and gondoling over rivers and everything. I mean, she's up for anything. A midnight shoot running through the grass, and in shitty weather. And then the next thing she's dressed in like Chanel and looks phenomenal. I mean, she is the Swiss Army knife of this entire series. She's amazing. She can do it all. And I love Karen Dor.
They do really interesting things with the female characters. I think Dor is probably the one who is given the most agency and competency, but they often sort of force the main inspector and the female lead to fall in love in a way that it almost seems like they're making fun of it, or like they're not taking it seriously and they feel like it has to be in there, and everyone makes jokes about it in the film.
Well, that Sunny is knitting jumpers at the end.
Yes.
It's just like, well, of course you 2 are going to get married and have children, and here are the 2 jumpers for that. Let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back right after these brief messages.
Hi there, I'm Chris Dashew.
And I'm Jess Byard, and we're the hosts of Scary Stories We Tell, a weekly dive into true crime, the paranormal, conspiracies, and everything else that goes bump in the night.
From Kentucky Goblins to the death of Paul McCartney to hearing about what keeps Jonathan Frakes up at night and the cold case that inspired Twin Peaks, no topic is safe.
Tune in wherever you find your podcasts or find us at scarystorieswetell.com.
I know you know who I'm talking about. It's that guy.
Yeah, with the eyebrows, right?
He's in a million
the bushy
movies.
eyebrows.
Sometimes they're bushy, but he also sometimes have a mustache.
Yeah, but he shaved. Well,
no, he did. You know who I'm talking about. You've seen him in a million movies. We just saw him in that one thing.
Yeah, he looks like a pug.
Listen to me, Chris Gore, and Anthony Ray Bench on the Film Threat Podcast.
You got questions. Sometimes we have the answers.
Hello, Projection Booth listeners. This is Mark Begley, the host of Wake Up Heavy Recollections of Horror. You may remember me from Projection Booth episodes on The Antenna, Crumbs, and The Brood. And Mike White himself has appeared on my show where we discussed Eraserhead, Taxi Driver, The Evil Dead, and Shivers. Wake Up Heavy is a show where I talk about movies that blew my mind as a kid. Things like Phantasm.
These warning shots are bullshit.
Tourist Trap.
You're so pretty.
Dead and Buried.
Welcome to Potter's Bluff.
And Halloween 3.
The joke of the children.
Other guests have included genre film journalists Anya Stanley, Jerry Smith, Sam Panico, and Simon Fitzjohn. Every once in a while, I even convince my own daughter Cleo to join me.
Hey, that's me.
Usually, though, it's just me, a mic, and my memories of some really wonderful horror films. So come check us out, wakeupheavy.com, soundcloud.com/wakeupheavy, or your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget,
anything can happen when you wake up heavy. Ho, 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 ho.
No one is safe from the creature with the blue hand.
I'm not guilty.
No place is safe from the creature with the blue hand. imprisoned with loathsome creatures. Caged in a living nightmare of terror. Will you dare to face the creature with the blue hand? Starring the sensational new horror star, Klaus Kinski, the creature with the blue hand, in color.
All right, we are back and we are talking about Krimi films, and we're going to fast forward a little bit to 1967 and talk about The Creature with the Blue Hand. We've got the same director, and we also have Klaus Kinski in it, though in a delicious double role. He is Dave and Richard Emerson. While Dave is locked up in an asylum after being convicted as a murderer, Richard lives the plush life. Meanwhile, a murderer is wearing a black cloak and a blue metal gauntlet with Wolverine claws ready to stalk the family. So, Sam, when did you see The Creature with the Blue Hand, and what did you think?
I am really struggling to remember the first time I saw this. It was definitely a couple years after my first Krimi film. And it was one that as soon as I read the plot description, which you just did great justice to, but as soon as I read Klaus Kinski as identical twins and one of them is in a madhouse, I was like, holy shit, where can I find this? And so I bought a bootleg of it. And I think at this point you could probably even find it on YouTube. Like, this is one of the more readily available ones. And I was so in love with it. Like, as much as I love the early ones, I think if I had to pick a single favorite, it might be Creature with the Blue Hand, if only because everything imaginable happens in it. It's like, it's based, parts of it, it's a gothic horror movie where there's this cursed suit of armor, and the curse is gonna strike in the family, and everyone in the family's fucking terrible, and they all hate each other, and they're all trying to backstab each other. So it's like very kind of gothic melodrama, but at the same time, I cannot stress enough, Klaus Kinski as identical twins. So I've done sort of like Krimi screenings and lectures a few times over the past years. And I did a screening maybe like 3 or 4 years ago where I showed Creature with the Blue Hand and people lost their minds. If you're familiar with Klaus Kinski, to see him in one of these movies where he's not allowed to go full Klaus yet because he's not famous enough, but he can't like keep it all inside. And he's so good in all of these that he's in, but I think this is his shining moment where he has to go back and forth between playing Dave and Richard. And the only thing about this that I'm going to spoil is the twin who is thought to be insane and is in the asylum is of course innocent. And this is something you learn in the very beginning, so I'm not really ruining anything. And then you think, okay, well, maybe he's being framed by his twin brother who seems to be sane, but maybe his twin brother is an ally and he's being blackmailed. And like, you know that something is going on, but to have him go back and forth between playing crazy and sane and sort of seems like he's hallucinating sometimes, it's head spinning in the best way possible.
Nick, how about you? When did you catch this one?
This was one of the very first ones I ever saw. I saw this prior to Dead Eyes. I still do. I didn't go last year for obvious reasons, but I go to Columbus every year to stay at my late... Oh, this is going to take a minute to explain. So I get together with a group of very close friends. Most of them are authors, historians, Brian Sen, Mark Clark, Ron Borst, the famous movie poster collector, and David Hogan, Ted Okuda. These guys are like the most erudite cinema pals I have, in addition to you, Mike, and to you now, Sam. And I just have the absolute best time with them. I go down over Memorial Day weekend. I stay about 5 days. Cinevent, which is I collect movie memorabilia. I've done that since I was about 18. We just, drink and eat bad food and watch movies 6, 7, 8 a day.
Sounds great.
Oh, it's the best. Yeah. To me, it's, 10 Disneylands. I just have the absolute best time. Sadly, two of our group have passed away. The host, my closest friend of the bunch, and how I met everybody else was Mark Miller, also fantastic. I'm sure both of you are very well familiar with his book. It was the only book on the subject for forever and ever. Mark Miller was the author of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, a critical filmography of their 22 collaborations together, which McFarlane put out, in the 80s. I mean, he was sort of one of the guys that put the flag in the ground when it came to writing about Hammer. We always go over to our buddy Dave Harnack's house, and Harnack has what he calls the real-time theater in his basement, which is a 16-millimeter theater. I'll have to show you guys some pictures of it. He's got hundreds of 16-millimeter prints, and one of his favorites is Creature with the Blue Hand. So he screened that in one of his triple features one night, and that was the first time I saw it. It was maybe 2012. And yeah, jaw on the ground. I was like, for all the reasons that Sam says, as well as the fact that this apple cart is so overflowing with shit. It's got all the voyeurisms in there. I mean, those fucking parrots are, he loves his parrots. And it's got all the voyeurisms. It's got this sort of, Byzantine plot that's hard, and a haunted suit of armor, just like there's an actual Scooby-Doo, I think, with a haunted suit of armor, isn't there?
It is.
And Kinski as in dual roles, and poor, what is her name? I have to look it up. Fortunately, I have it in front of me. Poor Diana Kerner, who plays Myrna in this, is subjected to so much horrible stuff. But I think the scene that always got me, and I wrote about it in the book, was the scene where they're in the asylum in the lower level, and you're getting these little peep shows of what's going on into each of the inmate cells. That stuck with me, and is one of the things I spent a lot of time writing about in the book. So I saw it about 8 or 9 years ago, and it is with Sam. I have to agree. It's one of my it's in my top 10.
So joyful. So, Mike, what did you think? I need to know.
I didn't enjoy this one as much as Dead Eyes of London.
Well, you jumped. Don't forget, Mike. You jumped a whole millennium forward there in Krimi time.
Even at this stage of the game, it felt like they were recycling bits from Dead Eyes. Like I had only seen one Krimi film, and I was like, oh, well, they kind of just did that. I mean, you mentioned the parrots, and I was like, well, I think there was a parrot in the last movie.
It's the Strange Countess. They lift like a huge chunk of the Strange Countess and dump it into Blue Hand, But it worked.
Also, Dr. Mangrove.
Nazi supervillain here. I mean, this guy is way, way, way over the top. I love it.
Kind of going back to what we were talking about before with there's always somebody behind the criminal. There's an insane asylum. We should say that, and which I've kind of already alluded to. And we talked probably 2 years now about Murder My Sweet and the idea of an insane asylum. And like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang also has that. The whole idea of taking somebody that's quote unquote undesirable and locking them up drugging them up, putting them in an asylum, and just stashing away somebody, and they're completely powerless. It's like, hey, I'm not crazy. Sure, you're not crazy. And Dr. Mangrove, who runs this place, takes one of his own nurses and puts her in the clink as well. It's and just crazy. Like, oh yeah, no, she's crazy now. She must have snapped because of the pressure. Though that scene that you're talking about with like a Nickelodeon where the guy looks in and he sees the striptease and like, hey, you better check this out. And the next guy looks
in a cell.
The next one that they go to and there's that baby head in there and you're just like, oh my God, I just looked at Deep Red here. This is horrible. And then they get to the third cell and you see that crazy murderer guy. And I was like, well, it looks like he only has one working eye. And the guy who's going around with the blue hand only has one eye cut in the thing. So he's got to be the murderer. And I was a little disappointed that I figured it out that quickly. But then I was like, okay, no, this is a Krimi. So there's somebody behind him. And then there's the guy behind the guy behind the guy, and it's just like, what? Who actually hired Dr. Mangrove to do this
Apple
stuff?
cart that's just overflowing. I have to read to you, but now that Sam mentions it, I've got the entry in front of me. Regarding Mangrove, I wrote, he commits perjury, kidnaps Myrna, orders multiple murders, inflicts insanity upon his nurse, separately drugs Inspector Craig and Myrna. One disturbing shot features his monocled visage raising a hypodermic syringe and then depressing it in close-up into Myrna's veined arm, and tortures her with rats and snakes, all the while gloating at his own wickedness. Now, come on. How can anybody sort of like say no to that, right?
Nobody can out Mangrove.
When they had both the rats and the snakes in the cell at the same time, I'm just like, oh, well, that's all food for the snakes, right?
Waste not, want not. Suddenly, Vorher decided at one point snakes were going to be a common trope around 66, 67. He's like, nah, we need snakes. So snakes become. In fact, they actually take shots from College Girl Murder Snakes and put it in like another color film that comes after that. They just reuse the same snake shot.
I mean, towards the end, it was one of those, like, you pull off the mask and you find another mask under it kind of thing. Like I wrote, well, the murderer has to be Myrna. No. The murderer has to be Lady Emerson. No. The murder has, and it's just like over and over again. Like they keep turning. It's that drawing room scene. You talked about Christy. It's that drawing room scene at the end of this where it's just like, and it's you. No, it can't be me. I did this. Okay, well then it's you. And it's like, wait a second. It was him all along? I don't believe it. I did enjoy it, but yeah, I didn't enjoy it as much as the other one. And then also, because of what I was talking about, I was waiting for Sonny to show up and be knitting something. I was just like, oh, please, 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 let these two characters, let the inspector and let Sonny be in every single thing I see.
The shift in tone by then, it's pretty palpable.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it definitely, I was like, oh, well, maybe it's just the color is throwing me off. But no, yeah, the tone was very different. I found it enjoyable, but just not as much. That's why when you sent me your list and it was starting with earlier stuff, I was just like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll start here. I'll start more towards the beginning and work through these things. And then maybe I'll be able to handle that shift a little bit because, yeah, jumping 6 years in Krimi time, it was just so wild.
Believe it or not, Blue Hand is definitely... There's a level of sinisterism, Is that even a word?
It is now.
There's a level, there's like, it's a far more sinister text than say like Hunchback of the Morgue, which is, and some of the other color films that are played a little bit more lightly. I think there's genuine scares in Blue Hand that are great. There's some pop moments that are designed to get you to, jump a little bit. And then by the end of the film, when we're sort of in, underground crypts and everything, I think it's genuinely creepy. And it is such a bizarre psychotropic mix of all these different things from pop culture as well as the Krimiverse, as well as the late 60s culture, the culture that was pervading throughout Europe at that time and Western Europe at least. And it's just a big love cocktail, I think, to the Krimi, the Blue Hand. I think, Mike, you might appreciate it more when you see some of the color films, and I'm not picking on them. I like them very much, but they are very different. If you put on the Green Archer and then put on something like Hunchback of the Morgue, you're gonna see consistencies, but you're gonna see a lot of inconsistencies too.
I liked that there was a little bit of that self-reflexivity with the final line of the film. I was like, okay, well, that's kind of nice. I did like, there's a scene, I'm trying to remember if it wasn't a bar, but it was a place that Myrna gets lured to.
Yeah, it's a bar. Yeah, that's a parrot scene.
That's probably one of the most tense scenes. And then that room that I think it might have been Richard had with all of the mannequins that were hanging.
Oh my God, that's my favorite scene, but it's so creepy.
It's wonderfully creepy.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite sequences of the film, when they're sort of running through the mansion and the underground parts and going from place to place. Yeah, that scene's fantastic.
That they can't find the guy because he knows the ins and outs of the mansion better than they do, and then they find the map of how you get through all the secret doors that are inside of this mansion. That was fantastic. I love that Dr. Mangrove has a reprint of Guernica over his psychiatrist's couch. As soon as I saw that, I was like, wow, I really don't trust you now, Doctor.
Yeah, no.
Yes, those not so subtle Nazi, overtures are there, and it's perfect for his character. He is, sitting there with hypodermic needles, although he's not the one to actually say it. I think it's, I can't think of his name right now. Pincus Brown. I think it's Pincus Brown who actually says in one of these movies, he says it in German, we have ways of making you talk.
Yeah.
But Mangrove's pretty close in this with his syringe,
And that's the weird thing. Like, I feel like you could watch a bunch of these and have no idea about German history or what the subtext might be. But in so many of these, there is that, like, well, I was just giving orders.
We hear it. It's actually vocalized, and Mike, I bet Sam's written about this in her new tome. There's the Lanzer films as well, which were these sort of like exculpatory common soldier films that were being made in Germany after the war too, which was sort of like the common perspective from the average soldier's point of view.
They're basically propaganda.
You say it much more directly than I do.
Yeah, I'm not very good at tiptoeing around.
So I am very curious, what are some other crimies that the audience should check out? And are there any, and you probably will say no, but are there any that they should stay away from? Are there any landmines out there that they should avoid stepping on?
I'm sure that Nick will agree with me, and obviously if he doesn't, he will speak up. But to answer the landmine question, I would say the more obscure of these that might rehash some of the plots of the best ones, people aren't going to be able to find. So I don't think there's really any danger in that. More and more of them have become available, and there is a surprising amount on YouTube, either dubbed in English, which, ideally you would watch them in German, but hopefully most of what we're mentioning will either be available on DVD or bootleg in some form or on YouTube, but I don't think people will be able to find some of those later, more obscure ones anyway.
What titles would you recommend? What are some of your favorites?
Well, we've already talked about Fellowship of the Frog, which is a must-see and has one of the most insane, maniacal villains, but also insane in a cartoonish way. One that I really, really love, we've talked about The Green Archer as well, which people should definitely watch. There's this one from 1962 called The Inn on the River. The real title is Das Gasthaus an der Themse, so there might be a translation that's like The Inn on the Thames or something like that, but it is wild. It's about this serial killer who goes around, basically swims around in the Thames and kills people. He wears a wetsuit and kills people with a spear gun and uses the sewer to get away. It's basically like that really great Dutch film Amsterdammed. It's sort of like the proto version of Amsterdammed.
That's awesome. That is probably one of the next ones I will be watching because I am trying to do these in order a little bit. Do you have any others that you would recommend?
If you're trying to watch something a little bit later, I really love this one called The Sinister Monk from 1965, which is about... it's basically about this serial killer who wears a monk's robe and kills people by whipping them to death.
And Nick, how about yourself? What are some of your tops?
I'm right there with Sam for all the reasons that she mentioned about The Inn on the River. That is, that's way up there for me. I absolutely love that movie. It's shot with a lot of sort of exterior dexterity. There's a lot, it's one of those films that really leverages Hamburg and the port in really, really, really cool ways.
And then cuts in stock footage of London.
Because eventually, Mike, they move the base of operations to Berlin. So I love The Inn on the River. Now, I am absolutely nuts for Das Indischtuck, the Indian scarf, which is very Agatha Christie-esque. It's kind of the locked mansion mystery, Mike. And there's this basement as the bodies pile up, the basement's being turned into a morgue, but the basement's also kind of got like a chapel in it, So this chapel becoming a morgue as all these people are dying, and there's all these like hidden rooms, And it's kind of the opposite of a film like In on the River, which has so much really nice exterior work. Indian Scarf is just all contained. It's a set driven film, and it's a lot of fun. I'm a huge fan of the first 4 or 5 films, from Frog right up to Dead Eyes of London. That mix right there, those first, including The Red Circle and The Terrible People. I'm nuts for those. The color era, this is where things get a little funky with me. I think my favorites are A Blue Hand, which we've talked about immensely. And then I'm a sucker for 2 others. I'm a big sucker for The Hound of Blackwood Castle, The Monster of Blackwood Castle, which I thought I wasn't going to like very much, given the trajectory that the color films were starting to go down. And yet I found it really refreshing and a lot of fun because Sir John becomes the main investigator of that film. So he's put out there as the inspector, which is great. And the other one, and I might take actually there's 2, and then I'll tell you what I would stay away from. And I'm picking these out because they're kind of like picked on. The least, well, if not the least, one of the least liked films is the Gorilla von Soho, not the Hunchback of von Soho, but the Gorilla. It's called Gorilla Gang. I actually love that movie. I love it because of its flaws and foibles, and that's all I'll say about it. I think its heart's in the right place. And then I would say the last film they shot in Berlin as part of the Rialto production unit is a film called Die Tote aus der Themse, with the American titles, Angels of Terror. And that's the last one. And I thought it was a fine send-off. I went into it thinking, oh, well, this has got to be bottom of the barrel, the dregs, right? Because it's the last film. And I actually liked it. My argument in the book was of the last 4 films, 3 of them are Italian co-productions, and I think 2 of them are really excellent. One is What Have You Done to Solange, which is an outstanding giallo, and this one, Angels of Terror. The 2 that sort of bumper that, which are A Doppia Faccia, Double Face, and 7 Bloodstained Orchids, they're acceptable within really inspired moments, I think, giallos, but as krimis, they're obviously pretty much non-existent. I mean, and that was the problem, Mike, was that these films were marketed in Germany, in West Germany, as krimis, and yet they're not. They're giallos. As giallos, that's really kind of I have to look at them. So when you approach that phase of it, bear that in mind. The one film I think is kind of a stinker in the whole bunch is it's actually Voorhees' last movie. Even though I think it's excellently made, I think it's kind of a stinker, and that's The Man with the Glass Eye from '69. It's got a lot of things. I've
never seen that one.
Well, I don't want to jaundice you. It's got a lot of.
Are you making an eye pun on purpose?
Yeah, I was not, but thank you for pointing that out. And it'd be yellow, right? So
exactly.
When I write about the film, I say I think Voorhees goes out with his head held high, and it's excellently made. But I just think it's kind of just it just doesn't hold together as much for me as some of the other ones. And then of course the other one that gets picked on a lot is Double Face, Doppia Faccia, because it's the pace is ultra slow, But again, these are not krimis, not in the way that they were defined for a dozen years.
Yeah, no. I don't think those last ones count.
I agree. In co-production financing only, that's how they count. That's why I had to do them, because they were the co-productions. But to me, they're giallos.
And they feel like giallos. They also look like them.
And then, Mike, it's a big round robin, because you go back to that early stage and you see the giallo's fingerprints, kind of like emerging out of the krimis. So it's.
Well, I think that's also why, if you're a big giallo fan, that's why it's worth watching some of these. I mean, I think they're worth watching because they're delightful, but also if you like a lot of those tropes, like here's where they came from. Also, to your point earlier about the kind of comparison between Hammer Studios and the Krimi films, we should definitely mention that Christopher Lee is in some of them. And he's in this one that I really like called The Devil's Daffodil, which is all about a drug smuggling ring and has this sort of crossover. It's like
Chicago meets London. Isn't that the one? Yeah.
It's like Chicago meets London meets Hong Kong, and there's like a little bit of that like triad kind of yellow peril action, and Christopher Lee's in a bunch of those movies. But the thing that I find so frustrating, and I don't know if this exists anywhere, Nick, you might know, but so Christopher Lee spoke German and wanted to do his own audio. And I guess that wasn't possible because of the way that they did the sound recording in studio afterwards. So if you watch Devil's Daffodil in German, it's not Christopher Lee's voice, even though you can see that it matches up with his mouth moving. Like you can see that he's speaking German, but the English language version that I've listened to, it's also not his voice. And this is a totally random aside that no one but me cares about, but, you know.
Oh, well, absolutely. In fact, my print of Secret of the Red Orchid, the second, Christopher Lee film, his entire part is done in his own voice in German, if you guys want it.
Oh, that's wonderful. I wonder if maybe there is like a print of Devil's Daffodil that exists, and I just tried to watch it when it was not available.
I believe I'll have to double check on that. I watched that one 2 summers ago. But Red Orchid, for the listeners, yeah, Christopher Lee in this one plays, he's like an FBI agent.
That's the Chicago meets London one. Devil's Daffodil is like London meets Hong Kong.
Yeah, he's in Yellowface in that one, right?
Yeah, he had to do that a lot.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, all the way up until, God, what did I see in the theater in the early 80s with Christopher, not the Fu Manchu. Yeah, it was the last Fu Manchu film, wasn't it?
The Jess Franco. Speaking of Jess Franco, he also made a sort of a Krimi film, which I don't think it counts, but, if we're mentioning things on the side, Devil Came from Akasawa was produced by CCC Film and is based on an Edgar Wallace novel, but feels nothing like any of these Krimi films.
I enjoy the 2 Franco Krimis, the Death Avenger of Soho. I love them, but I love them in Franco's canon. They're not, like you said, they're very far apart from this, but yet at the same time trying to belong to it in some sort of marketing way. And endearing. Yeah. He kind of like he puts his own Franco stamp on the Krimi, which is a hard. It takes a director with considerable chutzpah to try and do that, and of course Franco pulls it off. I got to say though, Mike, it's really important that we mentioned that there were revivals of these films in the early 70s, but where they really got extraordinary generational traction was through television, both in West Germany and East Germany. And I mean, I interviewed a lot of people and talking, about like how the streets would empty. And the mom would say, fend for yourself, peanut butter and jelly, I don't care. There's an Edgar Wallace, it's Krimi night, So they would go to the electronic fireplace and watch Krimis. And, it was like the streets would empty. And I'm like, you're kidding me. And they're like, no, it was like, it was like event television when there was a Krimi on, a Rialto Krimi. And again, because they became so popular in syndication and so ubiquitous over the decades, they got 2 parodies in the 2000s. The Vixer, which is it's a euphemism for jerking off. I'm trying to think of what the
whacker.
Whacker, that's it. Thank you. Der Vixer is the whacker. And then they did the sequel to that, Neues von Vixer. I've only seen the first one, but I have to say, I laughed like I was watching Airplane. I absolutely loved it, every minute of it.
Yeah, I really need to see those.
People like Sam and I who know this series backwards and forwards, these films are made for people like us, who get every little joke. And Mike, hopefully you'll be there once you start watching more of these, because I mean, it's really funny.
Yeah, next year we can do a Vixer episode when Mike has seen them all, because I can see you falling down this hole.
This is a hole I want to fall down. I can't thank you guys enough for introducing me to this. And this is one of those gifts that the podcast gives, is just being able to have conversations and talk about films that I probably never would have seen otherwise. Like, it's great to read a book, it's great to read an article, but then to motivate myself to do this, I have to set up a podcast. And it's just like, for fuck's sakes, I got to do, I need to do this. What are the ones that I should watch? You guys gave me some great titles, and I will be forever grateful for this. And Sam, I read your article after watching both of these movies. It gave me a lot more to look at. I can't wait, Nick, for your book to be out. When is it going to be out?
So, yeah, I'll tell the name again. It is German popular cinema, because I write a lot about that as well. But the focus is on the Krimi, German popular cinema, and the Krimi phenomenon. It should be out by the end of the year. The manuscript is out for peer review right now, and then the usual process after that, edits, proofs. And so I would think by the end of the year.
So exciting.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you.
And Sam, when is your new book coming out?
Before I talk about my book, there's one really important thing that I had at the top of my notes that I wanted to mention and didn't get a chance to, will take a second. But so earlier we were talking about how there's this very tightly knit group of people who work on these films. And one of my favorite of them, who we haven't mentioned, is they're basically, especially the early films, the composer, the musician who scored these. His name is Heinz Funk, and I just need everyone to know that. That is the man's real name. I sadly did not get to write about Heinz Funk in my book, which is called The Legacy of World War II in European Art House Cinema, and that will be out from McFarland in the spring. It's up for pre-order now, but I don't know the specific date.
Fantastic. And I've seen the cover, and I was drooling.
I still can't believe that it's coming out, so hopefully I will not drop dead before then.
Nick, what are you eyeing for your next project? Are you going to start covering those Schnitzel Westerns?
Oh, nothing, man. Two books back to back pretty much killed me. Working full time, it was a bit much. I think if I do something next, it'll be something shorter, perhaps a chapter in an anthology or something like that. But I don't know. It's a good question, Mike, because you're right. I usually do have something percolating on the back burners or whatever, and right now I am so thoroughly spent, that I'm just not going to think about writing for a while. I sort of really need to replenish the well of ideas. And I mean, it's always good to know that you can still pull the plow. I started from a standstill on this. My book on Spanish horror had recycled dissertation material in it, about 20% or something like that. So I had a head start. With this one, it was just, research a subject, find out what's been written, try and fill a gap, get the money, go to Germany, do the research, watch the films, and having watched a few of them. And as I said, you might say that maybe, and I say this in the book, maybe the idea for a full book length study of the Krimis was born when I was in my 20s, in the 90s, reading film facts. Mm-hmm. Because I couldn't find anything about it. It was pre-internet, there's no internet then, or internet 2.0 that we know, that wasn't a thing. And you'd go to the libraries and, go to the card catalog and find Krimi. Yeah, good luck, could barely find anything on, Hollywood cinema. So it might have started then. So you're right. I probably should have an idea what I want to do next, but I don't. I really don't.
I wish I had that problem.
Well, let's not make it another 4 years between your appearances on the projection booth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was honored to be here with you both, and thanks for having me, Mike.
Sam, do you have any other projects that you're working on? Because to your point, you do tend to have quite a few irons in the fire.
It's terrible. I told myself, finishing the book last year was exhausting. I think mostly because of quarantine making everything exhausting. And so I told myself that I was going to take this year off from writing a book. And of course, I already started working on another book. And for me, I have usually different levels of projects. Usually I'll contribute chapters to like book compilations, or I'll be working on sort of like a shorter form book. Like I've been working on a book on the Tenant for a while, but that probably will be pushed back until next year or so, just because of the, like, when the publisher needs it. But I love that movie so much. But my brain just was like, hey, here's this long form project that's going to require a lot of research, and you should start working on it.
Well, thank you so much again for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.